in our next integrity check, which was for free edges. Now, those are not under the integrity check dialog here. These are just the element connectivity and the overlapped elements. It's under the view menu under edges where you can have it display free edges. Now there are a lot of edges in here that are supposed to be free edges, although this is a mirrored model, so a lot of these won't be free because they'll be connected to the mirror of this hull. We usually don't care about just the free edges. If you want to review the free edges to make sure they're only where they're supposed to be, you can. You'll find a lot of them around any openings in the deck, bulkheads, or if you have lightning holes, or if you've modeled beams with elements rather than as beams, you may wind up with quite a few free edges. So for this one, we're going to say no, so we don't create that group. But whether you do or you don't, the next question it's going to bring up is, would you like to check those edges for modeling errors, which we do. So this is the check that we're really concerned with. And it says possible modeling errors were identified in 232 free edge elements. Now, that seems a little odd since there were only several dozen free edges to begin with. Now, the reason it's a higher number is because when it finds a free edge, it flags every associated element with that free edge, and they get collected here. So when you clean up just one free edge, that number is going to drop by a lot more than one. You may clean up 8 or 10 elements for every edge that you fix. So these we'll put into a group. And if we go into the groups tree, you'll see under general, there's a free edge error. The other group that would have been created was just free edges. This one is free edge errors. And the edges that have a problem are highlighted in red. So we can see it looks like there was that tank bulkhead here on, I think, the third deck actually, but it looks like it's between stiffeners on the deck and we didn't split these elements to match up with it. This is that section of hull that we noticed earlier where we had a frame that was overlapped with the bulkhead, but there were two elements that didn't get flagged as being overlapped, even though they're coincident here. Well, the reason was apparently because there was a free edge. The nodes didn't quite line up. The beam nodes weren't quite lined up with the mesh nodes. Right now, everything is in gray, and you just see the free edges, or the potential free edges, highlighted in red. We can use the same trick that we did previously to see where they are in the overall hull, because if there's only one or two of these, like if these were the only two that showed up, you may have a very difficult time figuring out where exactly in the model they are. But if we show them in context, now we can find them very easily in the model, and it makes them a little easier to review. Start off with just trying to fix these two up in the bow. And you can see the edge errors are still highlighted in red, which is useful. Now, as we fix things, eventually that's going to go away. And if you want to get the flagged red edges back, you'll need to rerun the view edges command. And to get back to it, it's the same way we did it previously, where we have to switch to element type and hit refresh. And then you simply turn on free edges again. I say no, yes. And we'll make the group again, and we're right back to where we were. And sometimes as we clean these up, I'll go ahead and rerun that check just to update this. Now, a lot of these free edges can actually be fixed right from here in the group dialog because it's a free edge error. And if we look at this one, well, that one's pretty easy to identify. We have a pair of quads and a quad below that doesn't have a split there. So we could use either this refinement tool to convert it to a quad and a tri, but whenever you do that, whenever you use these tools, the split is always halfway across. And you can see on this beam, okay, the beam is split appropriately. It's got two little pieces, but the quad needs to be split. But if we split it here, it's going to split at the mid section there, or at the midpoint, which is fine in this case, although since it's splitting on the wrong side, if we do it in this view, if I double click this, it disappears from the group, mainly because that quad was destroyed and it created one new quad and a new try. So that's why it's not displayed in the group anymore. But if I come back into the model, if I use this context default color and we view these pieces in context, it was right here. So we'll pan the view around a little bit and we can use our cutting planes. So I'll just set a dynamic cutting plane for X and we'll start at this location and slide it forward so that we're just looking at this bulkhead. I know this was my bad edge here. So at this point, I'm going to switch to element type and refresh. And we can see the new quad and try that were created. Well, I want the try on the other side. So I have to come in here and there's an easier way of doing this. So you don't need to do it this way. I'm just showing you this was sort of the original way that this would be done. So I'm going to rearrange this try to be on the other side, and then we'll take the quad and select it. And we know from the arrow, this is node 1, this is node 2. So I'm going to reassign 1 and 2 to here and here, and we'll modify that. So now we have the try on the right side, but we need to move the point over to there. Now, when I moved these, I could have selected that point if this was in the same module, which it is since they're both part of the same bulkhead. But if this was at a deck break and one was on the second deck and one was on the third deck, they may be in different modules, in which case I'd have to copy the node over into this module. The easier way of moving it is to just use the merge additional nodes, and you can grab this one and double click to relocate it over there. Now that free edge should be fixed. We had another one further down, free edges. Because I have that cutting plane still on, that's why we only see one of these. If I turn off that cutting plane, we'll see the rest. So it looks like the beam break is in the wrong spot. And I can switch over to element type right here, still in the group view here. And if we do a dynamic query, we can see what the extent of each one of these elements is. So all of our quads and tries, they all match up. It's this beam and this beam, they're broken at the wrong spot. So not a problem. We can use that same merge additional nodes tool and move that node over. Just click on it and then double click on where you want to move it to. Now those types of manipulations work fine in the groups dialog, but the one thing we can't do in the groups dialog is delete, because all you're doing is deleting from the group. When you split or move something, that gets reflected back in the main model. A lot of these cleanup items in here, you don't have to go back into the main model. Now, what I'm going to show you next is a really useful tool for cleaning up these free edges. And this is under the model menu, under elements. There is a command to split and merge elements. So, and this is very useful for like this situation where we have a whole bulkhead here and all of the quads underneath it need to be split, as well as a few of the frames underneath that bulkhead. Those frames are going to need to be split as well. Now, originally, the way to do that was going to be to grab the split element, and you'd have to come in here, double click, and split each one of these individually. And you can see that bulkhead is not right in the center of the elements. So not only would you have to split each one individually, then you'd have to move all of those nodes over to line up with the bulkhead. Now, moving all of those nodes as a group isn't too bad, especially now that there's this, merge additional node. You could, single click and double click to move them over, or as you might recall, you can use the nodal group and you can select a whole bunch of nodes at the same time and then say modify additional nodes, and we would simply change the Z value, the transverse location, and we could move them all over very easily that way. But with this dialog under model elements split, we can control where exactly those elements are going to be split. So they don't have to be split in the middle. And to use this dialog, what you want to do, and there's several options in here, but the first thing you want to do is select all of the elements that you want to split. So we're going to split all of these under the bulkhead here. And we're going to split those beams that are frames underneath. So that's everything that's going to be split listed in the dialog, and we have a number of different ways of doing it. The methods at the top, slice, on edge, and merge nodes, are for splitting using a plane, splitting on edge where you use an edge of one element on another to perform the split. And when you do that, you should only have two elements selected. And then merge nodes is for merging things together. That one I haven't used much, and I actually need to look into it before explaining more about it. But what I have been using a lot lately is the slicing. And there's two different ways of controlling where these things are going to get sliced. The first is to select an element. And to select an element, since this is on a bulkhead, perfectly straight planar bulkhead, I can say use an element, and then you want to click in the cutting plane element and then select one of the elements on here. And what it's going to do is it's going to take this planar element and use essentially an infinite plane that corresponds to this element and cut all of the elements that you've selected in this group. Now, this works great on a flat deck or a bulkhead or something. If it was a warped quad from a piece of shell plate with compound curvature, I'd have to check with Ming to see exactly what it uses, because I would guess, and again, I'd have to check with him to find out how it's implemented in the code. I'm guessing it would take the normal from the element and possibly the first node, one node, or maybe the centroid to define the plane. But when it's a perfectly flat quad like this, or a tri or a beam, you can treat it as an infinite plane. So we'll go ahead and say OK. And all of those have been split. Now, because we're in the group view, it destroyed all of those elements and replaced them with pairs of new ones. That's why they're not shown here. But if we go back into the model, where it was in the model, so it's the bottom of that bulkhead, and we'll go ahead and put a cutting plane. We'll use the water plane here, and we'll drag down from the top so we can get a good view from above, and switch over to element type and refresh. And just so we can see it from below as well, I'm going to set a second cutting plane. So we right click on the background window, go into cutting planes, and we'll use ZX to do a water plane, and we'll select below the deck and this and above for where we want to keep. So now we can look at that from below or from above. And if we use dynamic query to see how large each of these elements are, you can see they all got split properly. And at the end here, it split that last quad into a quad and a tri. Now to merge those back together, we can use this merge elements command. But in order to do that, this has to be our current part. So right now, you can see bulkheads is our current part. We need this deck to be the current part. So the easiest way to do it is probably set current part and click on the deck. And now we can come in, click on merge elements, click on one, double click on the other, and it converts those two tris into a quad. Now at this end, we still need another tri. We've got a full length quad and then two quads that it's being connected. So we can use this split elements again, but this time, instead of telling it an element that we want to split, if we had grabbed this element and used the same element to define where it was going to split, it would just be an extension of this bulkhead. It would have split it into two quads. And I'm also going to select the beam underneath it because that's going to need to be split as well. But instead of using an element, we can use nodes. Now, You don't have to define the third node. And again, I'd have to ask Ming exactly what the logic is, but if you give it 3 nodes, you can define any plane you want to be your cutting plane through this element. And obviously, if I selected 3 nodes over here that didn't cut through this element, when I executed the command, nothing would happen. But you could grab a large section of the hull in this window for elements that you want split, and give it some plane with any orientation using those 3 nodes, and it will cut any of those elements along that plane. Now, that third node is optional, so what we can do is we can just select this node and this node, and I would assume what it's doing is, because it sees the absence of the third node, it'll either use the normal of the selected element, or it'll see those two as having a constant y value and project the normal vertically. But at any rate, when you have a planar element and you just select 2 nodes, it'll slice according to that line basically that you've defined. So I say OK, and you can see it's cut it into what appears to be 2 quads. Now, this should be a trie, and if we actually go and look at this quad, you'll see that 2 of the elements are going to be the same. So we have node 2 and node 3 are coincident. Now, Maestro will treat this as a trie when it goes to evaluate everything, but in terms of display, because it's a quad with 2 coincident nodes, it's displayed in cyan rather than green. If we wanted to fix that, we could either destroy this and put in a trie, or we can use this split quad into 2 tries and just double click on it, and it basically created a trie and a collapsed trie. And if we shrink the elements, you can see the collapsed trie doesn't exist. So it was smart enough to know that it created a trie with 2 coincident nodes, so it's a degenerate element, and it didn't bother creating it. That should have fixed the free edges there. So we can delete this cutting plane now, look at the whole model, and we'll run free edge check again. See what we can find. And the numbers are dropping. We started with 250 some, I think, and now we're down to 105. So we'll put those in a group. Now, this one, well, we have 2 problems here. One was the overlapped elements, which were the 2 frame pieces that didn't get selected. And we still have these free edges that are listed in here. And as we use dynamic query, we can see that on the hull, they meet at this beam, but on the bulkhead, the node falls a little bit to the side of that beam. So we have a little mismatch right there. So the easy way to fix that, and we can't delete those beams because we're in a group, so we wouldn't be deleting from the model, but we can fix that node. And we can do that with just the merge additional nodes. I do want to see what's on the far side of that. Let's take a quick look. That might actually be that 5-meter floor. So let's take a closer look at this. We'll go into the model. See where exactly it is. We can cut a dynamic cutting plane. And so it's a vertical bulkhead, and it is at the 5-meter. While we're here, we can clean this up by deleting those 2 beams. And again, if you select the wrong thing, you can keep clicking and then just simply put the things back that you don't want to delete. And if you've grabbed a bunch of quads in here, you can sort by type so that the bars are all grouped together, and we'll grab the quads and tries and return them. And then we can delete those 2 bars. That beam, which is on bulkhead, but because it was normal to the hull, it didn't get flagged as an overlapped element, but clearly we don't want that beam at the base of the bulkhead, so those are going to have to be deleted as well. Now that goes further back, we'll have to take care of that afterwards, but I'm going to delete those two for now. And now that we're looking at that and we don't have the beam on the hull anymore, it's the hull node that we want to move over because we want to keep our bulkhead straight. Now we can get rid of that cutting plane. Now we know hidden in there is a beam that we want to get rid of. So there's a couple ways we can find that. We could use a cutting plane from the other side to kind of peel back part of the hull and look inside, see where that is. One way, and back in this area, you can see those got deleted because they were vertical. That was the flat bottom, but from this point forward, they didn't get flagged. So that's the extent that we need to get rid of. Since we've already deleted a couple up here, we can just grab one and say add by seed, and it'll, there's a break here and a break there, so it'll only go this far and select these items. If it was buried deeper in the model, instead of using the cutting plane, another option might have been to go to the outside, and we can use that view hide elements command and select one of these and add by seed, and that'll hide the shell, but not the connected beams. This isn't a great way of viewing that either. There's too much clutter. We can refresh that. Another way of doing it would be translucency. We could make everything translucent so you could see through it, but again, that's probably going to wind up with too much clutter. Our best bet was probably to use the cutting plane. And you could either use the dynamic, or we could set an XY plane here. And we grab that point and select the far side to reveal that beam. And then we go into the deletions dialog and grab a piece of that beam. And you can see I got the quad first, that we want to keep that quad. So I'm going to put that back in the model. You can just say add by seed. And that's approximately the right number of items that we were expecting. So we can go ahead and delete. And while we're here, you can see back aft, there's another section of bulkhead that has a beam on the bottom. And this is one where aft of the bulkhead, we do want to keep those stiffeners. So here we'll grab a piece of that beam, add by seed advanced, and we're not going to use the Y and Z values, we're just going to use the X values. So we'll go from the beginning of the beam to the bulkhead and add those. And you can see that's where it stopped adding. And now we can delete that beam. And we'll turn off the cutting planes. Run the free edge check again. So we're down to 40 free edge elements. Look for modeling errors. Still finding a few. This one, we have two quads up above and a quad and a tri below, but we have a single quad on the deck. So this is another area where it would be very handy to use that split dialog. We select that deck element, and then we can use the nodes, and we grab this node and that node, and that should split it into a quad and a tri. We look at the bottom down here. Now this seems odd. It looks like we have, two quads and a tri, two beams. Everything looks fine here. So we'll use dynamic query, and we can see the quads all line up. And that beam looks good, but this beam is too long. So it looks like when we made the polyline to export, it went from this point all the way to the end and then came back rather than from one end to the middle to the other end. So if we split this beam, then we'll wind up with an overlapped beam over here, two beams in that location. So what we can do is, and I don't think we can edit the beams in the groups dialog because the current part needs to be the module with these beams in it. So to fix this one, we probably have to go back into the model view down at the bottom. So we'll use a cutting plane again to be able to see it a little more clearly. We zoom in, set the current part and click on that beam, and then the beam elements dialog, and we click in the ID number and select the beam, and that line indicates that this is node 1 and the other end is node 2. So we want to reset node 2 to be this point here, but it doesn't want to select that, so we'll turn the points on to make it a little easier to select. A lot of times you can select a node by clicking near the corner of an element and it'll kind of snap to that node. But for this beam, it kept snapping to the end. It kept grabbing this beam and going to the end of the beam. So once we turn the points on, it makes it easier to select that node, and then we'll modify it. And if we go back into dynamic query, we can see our beams are fine now. So we'll get rid of the cutting planes, go back into a normal view. Now I didn't hit refresh, but that's just a graphics issue. You can see that the edges, free edges are no longer checked. So we can go ahead and turn those on. This seems odd. Why didn't that fix it? Well, I fixed this quad, but I forgot about the other side. What may have been better would have been to not split this quad, and we have these tiny little slivers of triangles. Maybe what would have been better would have been to get rid of the little try below, move that node out to the side shell. And we can still do that after we look at the other two at this end. Let's see what's going on with these. So this one is a simple, we have two quads above and a single quad below. We need to split that edge. We look at this from the other side to see what might be going on here. Same issue. We have a single quad, but there's a split edge there. And this last one, it's the same deal. We have a quad and a tri, but a single edge on the connected quad. And for this one, again, we can't delete from this view because what I'd like to do here is delete this tri and then move that node down to the shell. So we're going to have to come back into the model, and we can simply delete that tri and move that node to the shell. You can use the elements split dialog, and we want to split that quad, and we'll use the nodes again, and we'll go from that node to that node, split it. And now we have two tries over there that we're going to want to merge back together. So we'll make this our current part and use the merge command. Now I didn't get the double click quite right there, so I'm going to turn that off and turn it back on and try again. That time it worked. I clicked a little too quickly on the first time. And of This quad will need to be split at that edge, so we'll use the split dialog again, select those two nodes, and that should resolve that issue. And the remaining piece was back up forward, where we decided maybe it would have been better to move that node. So we can come in here, and we want a try up above here going into the side shell, but we currently have a quad. If we just move that node over, we're going to wind up with a collapsed try and a quad that becomes a try as well. So to make that happen a little more cleanly, we're going to split that quad into a quad and a try first. And then we'll delete these two tries. We can delete this skinny quad that we split earlier by mistake. And then we'll move. Actually, let me make sure this is the current. So the deck is now current. And I'll grab that node and move it to the side shell. And no, it won't let me grab the bulkhead. Let me make the bulkhead current. And then we'll try and move the bulkhead node. Let me grab that. So let's do a query. Oh, it says it's already been moved. It's been moved up above, but not down below. So let's select it from below. Now we fixed that. I'm going to turn off this cutting plane. And right now, what I've been doing previously was I've been right-clicking and saying go to the element type view. And the reason is if we were to try and redisplay free edges, instead of going to element type view, we could also just turn off the free edge display. And then, which is basically going back to the element view, and then turn it back on to try and reevaluate our free edges. And now we fixed all the free edges.